Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation on agency and community policies. My name is Jim Pavlik, and I'm the Senior Program and Policy Analyst at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And in my 8 years at BHBP, this is the area that I spend most of my time in, that is helping organizations develop these sorts of policies and the plans around them. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to walk us through, we're saying community and agency policies, but I may as well talk a little bit about what that means and where our focus is actually going to be, just so that we all have the right expectations. Agency policies is where we're going to spend, or organizational policies, that's where we're going to spend most of our time today, almost all of it. We're going to be talking about how to plan for and deploy a nicotine-free organizational policy. That is making sure that you are a good neighbor in a patient-centered or person-centered tobacco cessation health neighborhood. We are not going to be talking about legislation. We're not going to be talking about policy, advocacy, or tobacco control writ large. We're not going to talk about price floors and mass market media campaigns or point of sale strategies or retail licensing or any of that stuff, although that is all very much important. We're also not going to be talking about the things on this slide. We're going to assume that you know this stuff. And it may be the case that I will act as if you do know this stuff. So we're talking about awareness of the evidence-based best practices for tobacco, knowledge of the 5 A's, and also the stages of change. Hopefully you already recognize the disparate burden of tobacco use and its associated health outcomes in the communities that you serve. And we sort of hope that you have basic familiarity with both tailoring care to meet racial, ethnic, or educational needs that your clients or patients may have, and also some familiarity with the social determinants of health and health behaviors, and how those social determinants influence whether or not somebody is introduced to tobacco and at what age. It also mediates whether or not somebody experiments with tobacco, and if they experiment, does it become habitual or not? And once they have maybe developed a problem, whether or not the social determinants of health mediates whether or not that person decides to make a quit attempt or not. So we kind of assume you'll know all those things, and we need you to know those things to really understand how we're talking about what we're talking about today, which is to say, we're going to start, and like I said, spend most of our time talking about the organizational policy. But the point here is to place your organization with a good policy in a sort of community-driven effort to encourage tobacco cessation. And so that's what you'll see here, where you'll see on our objectives for today, we really are talking about the person-centered health neighborhood and identifying the key stakeholders of the neighborhood, and making sure that, like I said, we're going to share the characteristics of a good neighbor in the hopes that you become one, your organization becomes one, and also so you can identify good neighbors in the community as well. And then most of the day is going to be spent on this bottom point, outlining strategies to make sure that your organizational policy is sustained over time and contributes to the development of a person-centered tobacco cessation health neighborhood. And the reason we are so adamant about the idea of the tobacco cessation health neighborhood is because tobacco use is systemic, right? It comes to us by virtue of unjust, unfair systems. And if you see the result of something systemic, then the only proper response to that thing is systemic, or as this slide much more succinctly puts it, we need systemic solutions to systemic problems. And so let's begin by thinking about the health neighborhood as a system. Now, if you've already attended the Quitline webinar, I talked about the health neighborhood slightly differently there. So I'm sort of hoping that between these two, you're starting to get a real good sense of what a health neighborhood is. And here I want to really focus on the systemic nature of the health neighborhood, right? And I'm going to highlight a few of the words in this definition provided in that book to the left. A system of care, right, incorporates a broad array of services and supports that is organized into a coordinated network It integrates care planning and management across multiple levels. It's culturally and linguistically competent, and it builds meaningful partnerships. You'll see the highlighted words in orange there. And I'll start with the middle three: organized, coordinated, and managed. What we're talking about here is that it's not just the case that things exist in the world, right? I mean, I'm sorry, it is the case that things exist in the world, but the people that you serve, they go to a certain supermarket, right? Or maybe they have a choice between 2 or 3, or there's local convenience stores that they're also shopping at. Maybe there's some department stores that are nearby. They're also maybe working nearby. There's a bus system that goes through town, right? All these things individually exist, and there's no coordination between them necessarily, right? The bus line doesn't, your transportation authority doesn't call the supermarkets and tries to coordinate activities necessarily. I mean, that may happen, right? But there's nothing systemic about that. There's nothing planned or coordinated or managed about that. Those are just two things. So the point here is that it's not simply just the case that your patients, your clients, are out in the world and getting. They're not involved in the system simply because they get care from different points in their neighborhood. A health system or a system of care has to have an intentionality. Somebody has to conceive of it as a system and then facilitate that, organizing the activities. And the way that we normally talk about this in the health neighborhood is looking out across the geography of where your patients or clients live, work, and play, looking at what those resources are and saying, okay, are they getting all 5 A's? And if they're getting all, is anybody screening them for tobacco use? Is anybody assessing their dependence? Is anybody referring them to treatment? And then looking at those treatment options and trying to figure out if they have access to all the evidence-based interventions that have been given a grade of A by the United States Preventative Services Task Force. And if they aren't, right, then trying to make your organization fill in some of those gaps, and then also maybe taking on some of the burden of communicating to each of the various partners or neighbors in the health neighborhood to make sure that your patients and clients at least have access to all of the 5 A's and all of the evidence-based strategies, okay? So we really are talking about intentionality. A system is a system because somebody's caring for it as a system. That's the sort of short version. Each of the points of care that somebody may engage with in a health neighborhood we can measure the intensity of the intensity of the relationship between them. How frequently do they meet? How fluid is the communications between these points, these nodes in the network? And this is a table on this slide that was developed by SAMHSA. You can find it on their website. And it sort of measures 6 levels of integration, right? So at the very bottom, level 1 is what they would call minimal collaboration. So you're seeing things, some of the descriptors here are that they have separate systems. They communicate about cases only rarely and under compelling circumstances, right? So this might be something like you have a casual relationship, maybe with a judge at your local drug court, where the judge may call up a case manager and say, listen, I need you to pay specific attention to this case for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? So there is connection, there is collaboration, there is cooperation, there is communication between these two nodes, but it's really on an ad hoc basis, on a per client basis. It happens, but not consistently. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you really are thinking about these organizations. This is actually the kind of coordination you might see between divisions within a system, right? They're actually, you both answer ultimately to the same boss in some way, the same board of directors or the same director, something like that. And in the health neighborhood, I think we're really aiming for probably right about levels 3, 4, and 5. Mostly 3 and 4, right? At level 5, things are getting, you really are becoming the same organization. And that is something that can happen, by the way. It wouldn't be completely unheard of for you, people who are listening to me right now, to train somebody to make a quitline referral. And then maybe they're so successful that you actually bring them in-house to do those referrals, right? So they might start out at a food bank or a grocery store, or they're a community health worker, and they really they represent the quit line, for example, maybe at a health fair. They do quit line referrals at a health fair. And then over time, like they're so good at that job that you might hire that person. And then you're seeing like this merger happen. But really are aiming at levels 3 and 4, and to some extent 5, as a good goal for who you identify as another neighbor in your health neighborhood. And you can sort of describe your relationship using the descriptors in the table here and figuring out where you are, level 1, 2, 3, right? And making deliberate strategies to see if you can move the dial a little bit. You're looking at your relationship with a major referral source, and you're like, you know what, I think we're kind of like at a 2, right? We communicate periodically, right? We see each other at the health board meetings or whatever it is. But what if we made that a little bit more periodic? Like, maybe it's not just quarterly now, let's try to go once a month. And we start to, when that happens, there has to be a reason for it. So maybe you start to collaborate on a specific project, a task force, or writing a policy, and then you kind of move yourself into level 3 and so on. That's sort of why we have this chart up here. So you can kind of think about this analytically to figure out how you can make your partnerships more robust. We're going to spend most of the time today in this section, constructing a health neighborhood. Constructing a health neighbor. Your organization is what we mean by that. How can you be the best neighbor in a tobacco cessation health neighborhood? And this slide and some coming up, I'm going to be kind of going back and forth between tobacco-free policies and nicotine-free policies. BHWB has recently started adopting the use of the term nicotine-free. However, we have a toolkit that we wrote a few years ago before we'd adopted that language that's on tobacco-free policies. And they are identical, with the exception that we now really want to make a stronger case that e-cigarettes need to be included, and some of these other newer products that are showing up, like the nicotine salt pouches, right? We want to restrict or prohibit the use of non-medical nicotine, which is to say we still want people to use nicotine replacement therapies if they need those, right? So you'll see me vacillate back and forth. We are using them more or less interchangeably. How our conception of a nicotine-free policy differs from, I think, what most people think of, is that it is a little bit more expansive, a little bit more comprehensive. Most people think about this top left quadrant of the slide, the tobacco-free policy itself. Which products are covered, what activities are restricted, who is covered, what are the actual geographical boundaries where this policy is in effect, those sorts of things. And so there is a policy, right, that is typically written and adopted and put like in the employee handbook or the HR or management handbook. And that's fine. We think you need that, but that's not all you need, right? And I'll talk about this later on too. If we really want a policy that is perceived as legitimate and therefore is easy to enforce, then we kind of want to do other things too. So we have these client-focused interventions that we want to make sure that they're getting treatment, they're getting referrals. We want to drive the number of tobacco users in our client pool down. Now, we don't want to force anybody to quit, but we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to foster quit attempts, to inspire them, and also then to support them to success, because the fewer tobacco users there are, the easier a policy is to enforce. And it's just the case that if you are a service providing site and you want a nicotine-free policy, then there's almost not a moral obligation or a legal obligation, but like in a purely like philosophical sense, you want to be philosophically consistent, saying like, hey, we have a nicotine-free policy. We would like you to be nicotine-free. They just kind of go together. One of those things explains the rationale for the other thing. And that extends then to the staff-focused exercises. I have talked to organizations that offer that they have, case managers and counselors and therapists on the payroll, and they encourage their staff to avail themselves of those services in their own building. Now, I always thought that was kind of weird, but your mileage may vary. When we're talking about staff-focused interventions, we are primarily talking about education and training, but we are also talking about making sure to identify what their tobacco cessation benefits may be through the insurer or whatever, and making sure they know that. I'll say that again later too, when the right slide shows up. And we're talking about, and this is where we talk about our community policies. We're talking about our neighborhood supports. So we want to be a good neighbor in a health neighborhood, by meaning we want to be the kind of agency or organization that provides tobacco cessation services, and we do so in a really formalized, standardized way that comes with a culture of improvement attached to it, all those things. But we also want to be good neighbors, period, like just friendly, how's it going sorts of neighbors. So we want to make sure that we are in communication with our physical neighbors and also our health neighbors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But the point being that this is when I say community and agency policies, this is what I'm talking about. We want a really comprehensive, really expansive tobacco or nicotine-free policy that does not stop at simply the nicotine-free policy itself. When we put together our tobacco-free policy toolkit back in, I want to say 2016 or so, these were the 10 factors that we thought that there should be some planning around, or the 10 domains. Sometimes we'll refer to them as steps, but as you'll see in a little bit, there's not really a chronology here. Most of the activities for most of these things overlap with one another. One thing that happens really early on, it might be really the second thing that you will do, but it's really, really critical, is establishing your wellness committee. And I always like to emphasize that we say wellness committee. Most of them, when I've seen them in action, they are called a tobacco or tobacco-free committee. We don't like that terminology. We like a wellness committee because tobacco really does hit all the other health domains. And given that we want a really expansive tobacco-free policy, it's very likely that this can be done at the same time as, and with the same people as, the people who are doing other wellness activities. And also when we use the wellness focus, so maybe the same people who are reviewing the snacks that are in the vending machines, or reviewing the policies regarding on or off campus dining, or the catering, or if they're, maybe they're changing lights or putting in plants. They're doing all these things to say, like, maybe make the workplace, quote unquote, more healthy or more well. There really is like a big overlap with tobacco. And we also want to make sure that it's really clear that the rationale of our nicotine-free policy is also wellness, right? It's not about the restriction. It's not about this as a punishment of some kind. It really is about generating a safe, happy, healthy work culture, okay? The other thing I always emphasize here is, and what's pictured on the slide, is making sure there are lots and lots of voices, including smokers and ex-smokers, sitting around that table. And we do that because, first of all, it's going to help us make a better policy. It's going to make a more comprehensive policy that's just better thought out, and it's more likely to really fit your organizational culture. It's going to have the right language, right? And it's going to be written in the right order, and it's going to get out to all the right people. But more importantly, what it does is it strengthens the perception that this is a legitimate policy, right? When the people see, when the staff, when the clients, when the family members, when your neighbors all see who's helping design this policy, then they'll trust that it was designed appropriately. And what that does is it reduces the amount of resistance you're likely to get. So, which is to say, when I say reduces the resistance, what I'm saying is it makes it easier to enforce. And policies that are easier to enforce are just more likely to last longer, okay? I said that generating the wellness committee may be the second thing you do, and that's because the very first thing you're going to have to do is recruit the members for the wellness committee. And ideally, you would be doing that in a sort of fully transparent way. I have a different slide that I don't have in today's presentation that really talks about what kind of philosophy, or what is our approach supposed to be. And we really want to make sure that we are doing everything way out in the open. We want to make sure that people don't perceive any element of this as being thought of as shameful, right? You don't want to hide anything, because if you're hiding stuff, that communicates that you don't like it either, that you don't trust it, or you don't trust them. So we really want to be super transparent. And that means making a lot of announcements about what you're doing and why. And we also want things to be bi-directional. As part of your communication strategy, you really need to be soliciting advice back from the people who aren't on the wellness committee, but nevertheless probably have opinions about what you're doing. So, which is to say that really the communication strategy probably is the very first thing you need to at least start to think about, right? You're probably gonna, this is an iterative process. Like each thing you do is going to help inform the other things you do, and those things are going to help you with this thing. So this is a really good example where when you're thinking about your communication strategy, how frequently are you going to communicate becomes a really early key question. And it is partially answered by how long are you going to be communicating about this? And we'll talk about timelines a little bit. But if you have a 6-month time frame, a timeline, you want your policy deployed at the end of the 6th month, well, then if you say like, well, we want to make sure that X number of communications go out in that 6 months, that's going to be that X is going to be a higher number if instead you chose to have a 9-month rollout. Okay, so how your communication strategy is going to be informed by how your deadlines, but we haven't even gotten to deadlines yet. If you're communicating about your wellness committee, that means you don't have one yet. And so you're going to generate a very like rough sketch of a communication strategy. And when the wellness committee shows up, hopefully they'll change that, right? So every step sort of influences every additional step. So communication is probably the first thing that you need to be thinking about as you're embarking on this adventure. And it's going to run all the way through the program, including after the policy launches, because you want to make sure that once the policy is in effect, that you're still talking about it, that you're still sharing success stories, especially client-based success stories. You want to be able to go to the leadership or even to some of the maybe more resistant staff and say like, hey, here's a client that has a story they want to share about how this policy made their treatment plan more successful, right? So you're going to start with the communication strategy before you start almost anything else. And as you go through up to and through the launch date, you're going to change the nature of what most of your communications are about. So in the early box here, you can see this is like the phase 1. That's what a lot of your communications are going to be, those calls for recruitment, and also, establishing reachable deadlines and that kind of stuff. Once the editing process is starting, you're maybe communicating about those revisions and making sure you're eliciting feedback from folks. As the policy gets finalized, you're going to announce that has happened. You may have to announce a practice day. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then I've already covered what you may be doing after the policy is launched, which is all to say that it is a communication strategy, but you may be thinking of it in terms of the phases that your rollout is in at each point. Another one of the early things you're going to do is just really creating the plan to make the policy, which sounds maybe a little much, and I understand that. And one of the things that I do say, and probably heard me say in the Quitline webinar, if you've already watched that one, is if the planning process intimidates you and it stops you from doing something, then don't do it. But you do increase the risk of failure at that point. And in fact, when we look at the literature on different organizations that have gone tobacco-free at some point, which of those companies are still tobacco-free 6 months to a year later and which ones aren't, one thing they have in common is that all the successful ones have a wellness committee. They have a committee is in charge. This is not one person's job. And the other thing they all have in common, and there's actually one more after this, the other thing they all have in common is a good planning process. And the third thing they have in common, and we'll talk about this in just a bit, is leadership level commitment. Okay, the 3 tools for creating a change plan are the ones listed here, and we'll talk briefly about all 3 of them. So the first thing we always recommend is a logic model, and I'll have a resource linked at the end of this webinar that tells you what a logic model is and how you go about it. But the short version is that it's basically it should always be 1 page. It should try to condense all of the important factors of your plan down to 1 quickly reviewable page. Because what we're trying to do is, it's a logic model. We're trying to make this make sense. And so we want to see really clearly what is the intention of our policy and what do we need to make that happen? And what do we already have that we can use, right, to make this happen? And then when we say make this happen, I've been using that as a shorthand during this slide, there might be different effects in the short term, the midterm, and the long term. So this is the version that we put in our tobacco-free toolkit, and you can see that it really just condenses everything down to one page. So I mean, it might be a little hard for you to read here, but we are saying like, here's our inputs and resources. That's where you would say like, we have so many staffers, they have this level of education or these types of licensure. We have maybe some money for this scoped out in the budget, et cetera, et cetera. Or, maybe you have other neighborhood resources, that somebody's referring certain kinds of individuals to you. Those are resources too. Then next is, what are you doing and why? And you want to make sure there's a nice straight line between what your goals are and the things you're doing to achieve those goals, and then what you anticipate the outcomes to be. And that gets a little tricky. And I highly recommend both the Logic Model book that I'll talk about later and our Tobacco-Free Policy Toolkit that comments on this too. What is the difference between your goals and these short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes? Are the outcomes not your goals, right? Are your goals not your outcomes? And there should be some relationship to them, but it's not always a one-to-one ratio. Okay. I mentioned this already. The timeline really it's not much of a timeline. Everything sort of just happens all at once. And part of the reason for that is we really want the shortest possible time frame. Let me actually say that slightly differently. We recommend a 6 to 9 month project timeline. So from the day you send out that first email saying, hey, we're rooting for our wellness committee, up to the day of your official launch. We want that to be taking place within about 6 to 9 months. And then that also gives you 3 months to do your first evaluation, right? So then the whole thing up to the first evaluation is then a year long. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there really is a reason. There's a rhyme to the madness here, a reason for the madness here with 6 to 9 months. I don't know if that sounds like super long to you or if that sounds super short. My experience is that when I tell people I want this done in 6 to 9 months, they think that that is just way too short. And I have to say this, first of all, there are nicotine-free policies that you can download online and then just change the name of the corporation and it's yours, right? So you could theoretically do this overnight. I'm not saying you should do that. As a matter of fact, let me take a moment to say, I absolutely do not think you should do that, but you could. One of the reasons, and maybe the main reason you don't actually want to do that, is because nobody is going to trust that that's the right policy for them. Right? You need to be able to create the sense of thoughtfulness, right? The perception of thoughtfulness, of deep consideration, of being just, right? They need to know that their voices were heard about this policy. This is the legitimacy that I've been talking about already. And that actually takes time. And so you need to be standing up in front of them and talking about the policy and defending the policy and explaining the rationale of the policy and all those things. And you need to be doing it to as many people as you need to throughout some length of time. But people hate change. And the thing is, they hate changing more than they hate the change itself. So that's a really weird and sort of long-winded way of saying that if we are to measure people's attitudes and perceptions regarding the tobacco-free policy, the nicotine-free policy, over the course of, say, 6 to 9 months or a year, their attitudes and perceptions of the policy change literally for the better on the day the policy is official, the day it is launched. We have a native status quo bias and we feel change as a disruption in our guts. And so we need to not prolong that process. And we think that that's what we're doing. We think that when we make it a little longer, maybe we're being a little bit more thoughtful, maybe we're being a little bit more polite. But the fact is, we really just need to rip that Band-Aid off as rapidly as we can while giving us the time we need to actually consider this policy really well. I know I spent a lot on that, but this really is like where I end up talking to folks the longest is about everybody wants a 12-month timeline or longer. I've even talked to organizations that want to do things incrementally for 5 years. And that's just a bad idea. Do not do that. That policy that's got a 5-year deadline on it is never going to get done. It just will not. 5 years is going to come and go and no progress will have been made. Okay. Now I just said this. I think this is where most people's attention goes when we say like, well, you need to write a nicotine-free policy. They think specifically and only about this drafting process. And as I just mentioned, there are policies out there that you can just nab. I mean, you can just have them. And as a matter of fact, I've already told you that we wrote one. The HWP has on our website a model nicotine-free policy that you can download, fill in the blanks, find the things you like and the things you don't like, delete the things you don't like, tweak the things you do, and voila. This is not a long process. These are the things on this slide are the things you need to consider when you're drafting a policy, but we've already considered them for you. So you don't have to do this, right? This is a great exercise to just bring the model nicotine-free policy to one of your wellness committee meetings and then just hammer out the differences over the course of maybe your hour together. I've been mentioning this. We do want to talk about nicotine-free policies nowadays and not tobacco-free policies. To be fair, there's no perfect solution here, because if you say tobacco-free policies, then you kind of have to explain yourself around why e-cigs are also in it. E-cigs aren't technically tobacco. They are sort of legally considered quote unquote tobacco products by the FDA, but that's a lot of weird intellectual acrobatics. Nobody enjoys that. But the flip side is also true with nicotine-free policies. We don't want to discourage the use of nicotine replacement therapy, any other reason somebody might be medicinally taking using NRT, right? So we have to explain that. So it's kind of a pick your poison situation. We think that the nicotine-free policy makes more sense, mostly because of the arrival, not just e-cigs, right, but also, like I've said this already, the nicotine salt pouches and that kind of thing. We always want to tie our nicotine-free policy to our larger corporate mission, right? And so if we're offering health services, whether that's mental health care or physical health care, it really is just hard to justify allowing people to use tobacco or really any drug on your property. So we really want to start there and build up from the ideologies that bring people to work for you, that bring people to get care from you. We do want to start talking about nicotine more broadly, and then really, this is why we wrote our nicotine-free policy, was to produce an updated policy that really just has a lot more robustness built into it. And of course, we want to make sure we're talking about e-cigs in that. It's critical that we don't just align the rationale of our policy to our larger corporate mission and values, but that we also bring it all the way down to the individuals, extending that value all the way down to the people that we care about. And that's both our staff and our clients. And every company that has an employee handbook, we think of that employee handbook as just sort of like a list of rules, but everything in there has a purpose, right? And a lot of that purpose is sort of the mundane task of management, that we need to standardize the way that we do things just so that they can be compared to one another, and that they're consistent and there's no overlapping of efforts and all this sort of managerial cost saving stuff. That's the boring stuff. Other policies and procedures are really about the safety and security and the comfort of the staff, right? And so we kind of want to put the nicotine-free policy in that context. And one of the ways that we do that is we make sure to associate the nicotine-free policy with pre-existing policies. And we make explicit reference to these associated policies because, for example, you probably already have, whether you know it or not, a policy regarding whether or not people can be drenched in cologne or perfume when they come to work. And that's normally under the category of aroma or odor. Sometimes it has like a hygiene feel to it, and this can get kind of weird, and I understand that, but you probably have something like that. And so then when we add, you can't come to work smelling of smoke to our nicotine-free policy, then we reference the aroma or odor policy. And we do that because we start to perceive the more policies that are associated with our nicotine-free policy, we see the nicotine-free policy as being the natural outcome of all of these other things. If we're being logical and consistent, then the nicotine-free policy is sort of an essential policy that we haven't had before. So this is like really filling a hole, filling a gap. And the other thing it does is you really are doing a lot of this stuff already. Like you're already, maybe you're in a facility where you have search and seizure or seizure and contraband policies. And so now you're just saying like, oh, on this list of excluded items or prohibited items, we'll just add tobacco products, for example, cigarettes, e-cigs, et cetera, however you want to list those things. Once your policy is going to have a launch date, and going all the way back to our communications strategy, you're going to have several deadlines throughout your process. There's going to be the deadline for when the policy will be drafted. There's the deadline for when the committee will vote to pass it to the board. There's the date that the board should approve the policy. Then there's the day you're going to launch the policy. Then there's maybe the evaluation review cycles that you need to partake in. Each of these things has a deadline, and that's going to be a known date on your calendar. And part of developing the perception of legitimacy is also to showcase competency, which is sort of the fancy way of saying, announce your deadlines specifically so that people can see you hit them. And I'm bringing that up mostly because one of the deadlines that you can assign to yourself is the practice day. There's a lot of dread around a policy when it goes live. And a lot of that dread, especially in the community behavioral health centers, is that people will revolt, that they will literally start fights in the hallways. They'll smash chairs through windows. They'll light things on fire in protest. And the fact is, that never happens. And maybe I shouldn't say never, just because it's a big world with a lot of people in it, and somebody's probably done something like that. But generally speaking, that's not a thing that happens. And it's really good to show people that that's not what happens. But there's also a better and more grounded reason to do a practice day. And that is your policy has a lot of moving parts, right? Maybe you started practicing your scripts on how you're going to handle infractions. You're going to walk up to people, you're going to hand them a business card with a big smiley face on one side and a piece of nicotine replacement therapy gum, on the back somehow, stapled in a little baggie or something. And you have this script and you're going to practice it. And maybe part of that script is to say something like, hey, here's a free nicotine replacement therapy gum. Here's how you use it, blah, 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 blah. If you need more to help you get through your shift, go see so-and-so in HR, right? Or go see so-and-so in compliance, or go see the director of our wellness committee, right? Maybe you get halfway through that practice script and then you forgot who that was, or maybe that person forgot that they were in your script. And so people are going to start coming to them to get the additional nicotine replacement therapy gum, and they don't remember where it is, right? Or maybe they've forgotten where the key is, et cetera. And so it's really good to actually practice some of these things so that you can hammer out the details and have a more successful launch day. At any rate, the launching your policy is a whole thing, and you should be making it a celebration. You should be making it a party, and it should come equipped with some visible changes. People really like this like New Year's type effect, where it's like a new year, new me, right? So when they see the new signs go up, or they have the big ribbon cutting ceremony, or there's now music in the hallways, or whatever you're doing to make the launch day and a big celebration, that helps make sure that raising the visibility policy makes it so that people are aware that it's live now, right? It's hard, make it hard to ignore, and then you'll get more compliance out of it. Because some people, most of your infractions are going to be, especially in the early days, people who've just forgotten that you have the policy. So you got to make it harder to forget. This is the short version. I've alluded to this several times. You do want to evaluate your program, and the evaluation phase really does begin at the very beginning, because you have to start to think about what data is going to what data do you need to collect in order to show that your program is working or not, that your tobacco-free, nicotine-free policy is working. And sometimes that means creating new systems to identify and collect that data, getting it from your IT department and over into the hands of somebody on the wellness committee in a form that they can use. And then, what does that look like in terms of how long does that person get to analyze that data? When do they present that analysis? All those sorts of things. You want to start that kind of early on, and maybe even do some test runs of that process before you even launch, just because, again, just like the point from the previous slide, sometimes these operational logistical things can cause delays if you wait too long to practice them. So there are three things that people tend to get wrong about this. And I already mentioned two of them. The first one is that they tend to overly emphasize the restrictive parts of the policy, and thinking that just the prohibitions is the entirety of the policy itself, when really it needs to be these services and supports that I'm about to go into after this. The second thing they get wrong is thinking that the bulk of their work is in drafting the policy itself. And then the third thing, and maybe the one that I talk to people about the most, is their absolute fear of enforcing the policy and how they're going to do it and how often they're going to have to do it, who's going to do it, and all this enforcement stuff over and over and over and over again. The fact is that people are rule followers for the most part, and they don't like confrontation. The same reason that people fear the enforcement is exactly the same reason that you're not going to get as many infractions as you think, which is that people don't like conflict. And if they see that smoking on site is going to cause a conflict, they would probably rather avoid it. But it's more than that. And actually, some of the things that we've talked about today make it so that you'll get less violations, or less frequent violations. And that's all fine and good, right? The point being here that you really do need to think about enforcement. We just don't want to exaggerate how bad it's going to be. Enforcement, one of the key features of enforcement is really, especially early on, being fairly strict. And that sounds like I'm just coming out here on the side of the dictators, but it is the case that a more restrictive policy, and one that is being generally enforced at that level of strictness, is actually just easier to follow because it's easier to understand. Most of your violations, and I just said this on a previous slide, are going to be accidents. People get forgetful, or they don't know where the boundaries are, or they didn't know that e-cigs counted, or whatever it is. It's really just it's just because they don't know. And so really critical at the very early stages is enforcing everything so that they can see that enforcement happening, and they're going to talk about it in the cafeterias or around the water cooler, or you can even make a point of putting it in the corporate newsletter, like, this is how many violations there were, So you kind of need to do it early. And the other thing that's nice about strictness, and there's not a lot of nice things to say about strictness, nobody likes to be strict, is that actually moves us toward consistency. If people think that there is some leniency here, where some people are maybe not everybody has to enforce it, or maybe they're letting some people off with a warning, but other people aren't getting the warning, right? And then suddenly, if the staff, especially, and clients too, if they start to see that there's an inconsistency, that certain groups of clients tend to get warnings and others tend to get whatever the next disciplinary step is, then that leads to problems. Or if it's this client and not that client, if it's this doctor who's doing the enforcement and not that one, you start to see these inconsistencies, and they start to increase violations, because you're putting in there the idea that sometimes some people can get away with it, or sometimes in front of certain people you can get away with it. And you want to make sure, especially early on, that we don't create the perception of the policy just being weaker than it is, right? You have to enforce it, is the bottom line. When we talk about making the case, we really are thinking of three audiences. One is and the most important one is staff, right? And staff actually say two of the three, if not all three of these sentences, right? Staff treat the clients, and they want to advocate for the clients. And so they anticipate that the clients will hate the policy. And so they will try to offer rationales and reasons why we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't go to nicotine-free because the clients will do this X, Y, and Z. Staff also get their orders from leadership, and they'll say things like, "Oh, we shouldn't do this policy because the leadership isn't committed to it, and it's just going to go away. So we'll do all this work, and it won't go anywhere." And that can be really disheartening. Clients generally advocate. If they're going to advocate for anybody, they generally advocate for themselves. But you'll hear them say things also that the staff won't like it, or that leadership isn't convinced. but the leadership will also say the two above sentences. That they'll look at the staff and think, okay, the staff are going to hate this. But less important to them is the second sentence, and that's that the clients will hate it. They're not quite as in touch necessarily with the clients and feeling like their job is to advocate for the clients in that particular aspect. They tend to focus on the staff. So what that all kind of means to us is that it becomes really important to center the staff in the persuasive elements of our communication plan. Pictured on the right here is a great resource that we helped create with the National Behavioral Health Network, and you can find that on their website. So I'm going to talk about some of this making the case stuff. We're going to be looking at all three of these audiences, but you'll see that we're going to emphasize the role of staff as sort of being critical. One thing that really stands out when we start talking to staff and we are measuring their perceptions and their attitudes around tobacco-free cessation services and supports before and after policies or at some points throughout the process, one of the things we find out is that a lot of the staff resistance actually doesn't come from their personal use of tobacco, although that certainly matters. And it really isn't even about the client's, like, their rights, right? It's not about the client's rights. It really does come from a sense of uncertainty and to some degree, fear that they're going to do it wrong and they're going to incur a harm. They're going to cause harm in their clients. And so one of the things that we found is that if we educate staff in tobacco cessation services, including referrals, then their attitudes about the policy go way up really, really fast. We also want to make sure that we do help staff quit using tobacco. And again, the policy itself is not saying you have to quit, right? The policy is not saying we will fire you if you continue to smoke or anything like that. What it is saying, though, is that we support nicotine freedom here. And here's how we support it. We know that 75% of current tobacco users want to quit, and we know that 65% try every year, or 65% try each year. And so what we want to do is give them another reason to quit. And when they do decide to quit, we want to support them in that effort. So we are providing them education. And here we're talking about both the burden of tobacco, but we're also really talking about like training, skills-based training, and including how to make referrals. We also want to offer them tobacco cessation services. And I mentioned this early in the presentation today. We want to make sure that staff have access to cessation services. We don't necessarily need to provide the tobacco cessation services so much as we need to make sure that they have access to them primarily through an EAP or your employer-sponsored insurance, and that they know what those benefits are very, very clearly and extremely clearly how to access those benefits. And you kind of need to remind them over and over again, because while 75% of tobacco users do want to quit within the next 12 months or make a quit attempt in the next 12 months, that doesn't mean they're all going to do it tomorrow, right? Some of them are going to do it this month, and some of them are going to do it next month, and some more of them are going to do it in the month after that. And they can't forget that they have these benefits right when they need them. So we kind of want to make this a regular recurring feature that every 2 or 3 months or so, at least, we'd be reminding staff through a newsletter or an announcement or through signage or something what their benefits are and how to get them. And among their benefits, we are talking about the provision of medication-assisted treatment, right? In our case, we're talking about nicotine replacement therapy, Vernon cleaner, bupropion. If you can offer this stuff on site, we highly recommend it. And of course, this is also true for clients. But even for staff, BHWP recommends as part of this process adopting a tobacco-free shift policy, right? So it's not just the case that they can't smoke while they're at work; they really can't smoke while they're on the clock. So it'd be analogous to a lot of companies don't allow their staff to take a drink over lunch, right? You can't just go out to lunch, grab a burger and a beer. That's considered not very good employee-based behavior. So we can do the same thing with nicotine, but because of the way nicotine is used, the way it's processed in the body, we would see clients, or we'd be seeing our staffers go into withdrawal throughout the day and kind of hanging out in there. Or, we're really seeing them try to sneak off and just get a quick puff, or maybe they're bringing in salt pouches into work. They're doing infractions in other ways. We just kind of want to discourage that, but we don't want to just restrict it, right? We want to support the good behavior. And that might mean providing nicotine replacement therapy to help them get through their tobacco-free shifts. We're going to talk a little bit about budget and how we think about a return on investment. I'm not real comfortable with the idea that we should be looking for a return on the services that we're providing to clients. Okay. We don't look at depression and say like, okay, well, treating depression is an investment. What are we getting back? That's just not how we think about it. And we should extend that same thought process to tobacco. That being said, there is a return. Most of the return of a tobacco-free policy accrues to the clients or to the staffers, not to the organization. To the extent that it accrues to the organization, it's not zero. There is stuff, right? Fewer butts, less fires. These can reduce maintenance costs. They can reduce insurance costs. You're also seeing more productivity from staff. You're seeing higher job satisfaction scores from smoke-free or tobacco-free staff. And so these are returns to the organization. But if you really want to think of them in terms of returns on investments, then you really need to do the accounting. You need to write down how much all this stuff costs. And then you need to kind of measure the things that don't happen, right? So right now, your HR department tracks sick days. They probably can just run a report on who has called in sick on how many days, and they can see that as a loss of productivity, right? Theoretically, after 2 or 3 or 4 months of a smoke-free policy, at that point, you may have seen about 5% of the staff quit. And those individuals who quit probably will, over the course of a year, start having fewer sick days, right? Because I say over the course of a year, because one of the sicknesses that you get, or two of the major ones, are kind of seasonal, right? There's asthma attacks that can happen along with allergy season. And then there are colds and flus that smokers in particular are more susceptible to. So you kind of really want to see that over the course of a year. Did those staffers reduce their sick days? And you can see those scores in aggregate, but you have to be a little careful, right? It's harder to see because only 5% of staff quit on average when a tobacco-free policy goes into effect, and only between depending on your workplace, anywhere between 3 and 45% of your staff smoke. And so it's already not everybody, it's not even the majority. And so you're only going to see improvements on the lack of sick days score among the smokers who quit. Okay. So it just gets really tricky. There are returns to staff and clients. And I think this is where we really need to focus on. And so you are starting to see, and it's sort of the same thing, just better quality of life, less sick days. As I already mentioned, I think that we should really just think about tobacco cessation services as a function of our agencies, of our organizations. This is something that we do because it's our mission to do this, right? And so if we're just going to do it, then what we really start to think about is how cheaply can we do it? How inexpensively can we do it? Where can we see, how can we net savings? How can we leverage things that we have? What are our guerrilla tactics, right? Like I have the example of doing client poster contests that support, so instead of buying, this is a tobacco-free worksite signage, just have more fun artwork on the walls that say the same thing, and you're accomplishing both goals, which is to say that the type of analysis, if this is your bag, is a cost efficiency analysis, not a cost benefit analysis. And you'll see the 2 bottom bullet points here. I said try to measure avoided expenditures. That's what I was talking about with the sick day thing. The other thing to realize is that a lot of the costs of a tobacco-free policy are borne up front. Right? It's the training, it's the time that the wellness committee has to spend designing and rolling out and launching the policy. All those things go up first and early, and you get all those costs up front. But the gains are going to be experienced over the course of normally 3, 4, 5 years, right? So if you think about the fact that smokers take more sick days than non-smokers, not all smokers are necessarily maxing out at 10, and not all non-smokers are taking 0, right? So what you're talking about is you might save 2 or 3 sick days per staff member who quits smoking, which, that's 24 hours over the course of a year. That's not that much, right? And then, so you might need to see those gains over 2 or 3 or 4 years before they really start to pay against the originally borne costs. So now that we've spent most of our time talking about the health neighbor, you, what are the things you can do internally to create a robust person in you who is a good neighbor. Let's talk very briefly about what a health neighborhood is. And this is really more of a review for those of you who've already gone through the Quitline webinar. The short version is, we want to make sure that everybody in our service area, whoever your main audience is for your organization, that they are receiving at some point all 5 A's. That could all be happening at you. You could be the one-stop shop for all 5 of those A's. But it could also, some of these tasks may be able to be divvied out to other potential places. And the things on the bottom here are the 5 modalities of care that all have been given a grade of A from the United States Preventative Services Task Force. So we're going to use the 5 A's to get people directed to these things down here. You can also use the ask, advise, and refer method. And this is especially true if you're sending people to the Quitline, because the Quitline will take care of the assessment and assisting pieces on your behalf. But you kind of want to make sure that anybody down there that you send people to are at least capable of doing those things. And again, this is review, but if you're using the ask, advise, and refer model, you are going to have to do a little bit of assessing and assisting just to make sure that the referral is adequate. And here I'm saying, like, Quitline is just the number one tobacco cessation referral. It doesn't have to be that one. It could be any of them. But the Quitline, it serves as a good example because it says that we know that we have to do a little bit of assessing and assisting to get people there. And we also know that we have the possibility of implementing a sort of continuity of care strategy. And the way that we visualize that during the Quitline webinar is to say that, your organization very likely could be fully capable of doing all 5 A's. And that if that's the case, or if it's the case that you want to do ask, advise, and refer to another care site or to the Quitline, we're also having that relationship. And so the focus of this, right, is again to repeat that the referral process and the continuity of care process, these are the major focus of developing a health neighborhood. That the care exists is kind of a given. And which is to say, I don't know if there's if that care providing is established in your jurisdictions or not. But I also don't think that it's your job to go start a new healthcare clinic if that didn't already exist there, right? So the focus of our endeavors for the purposes of this conversation is to say that you need to be working on those referral processes and the continuity of care to make sure that those referrals are being acted upon, which is to say that the health neighborhood might require the creation of new services, but I don't expect you to do that. It concentrates on the relationship between the sites. And a lot of that work is it's the soft work, right? It's engaging community members to become tobacco cessation advocates. It's about changing changing attitudes. And one of the ways that we do change attitudes is we don't just go in and just assume that we can say the best argument in the world and people just suddenly change their minds. We actually do it. We practice and practice and practice. And I don't mean scripts here. I mean, we actually just do the thing. We make those referrals and we take the time out of our day to look at that referral process and to analyze it to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. And then once we think that we've really dialed in how we want to do it, we formalize it. We write it down. We make sure that when new employees get onboarded into our organization, they get trained on how to do it, right? It can't exist solely as a friendly handshake between 2 really passionate people, because passion waxes and wanes within an individual. And what if that really passionate person moves on to a new position, right? Changes companies, gets promoted out of that particular domain, moves down the hall, whatever the case may be. If the next person isn't passionate, then maybe they just don't do it. But if it's built into their job as a part of their job description, then of course they will. So these strategies that we're talking about, that's building sustainability, right? What we want to do is get to the point where providing tobacco cessation services and supports is just how we do things here, right? It's just not even It's not even a question. It's perfectly logical. It's the natural extension of all of our other policies. And it's got all these built-in client successes ready to go. And so, yeah, of course we do that. So very briefly, there are other videos in this series. I'm assuming that you're watching this one last for a variety of reasons, including the fact that I posted it at the bottom of the page. So I'm assuming you've seen all the other ones, but if not, definitely go check those out. These all do work together. You can find them all on our YouTube channel. I've already mentioned the Person-Centered Health Neighborhood video. Definitely check that out. If you need more on training the 5 A's, that middle slide deck is based as a train the trainer model for you to train other people how to use the 5 A's. You can also completely take out the green slides in that deck and then just learn the 5 A's yourself if that's what you need. And then the Stages of Change webinar is only 12 minutes long. And if you don't know the stages of change or really don't know how we're implementing them for tobacco cessation, highly encourage you to check that out. I mentioned these toolkits. And by the way, if you get the PDF of this presentation, everything that you're seeing right now are links, except for the videos. If you need help designing a logic model, this is a freely downloadable PDF. Again, this slide is also a link to that PDF, tell you everything you need to know about logic models. Great book. I already referenced it once with this slide. Again, this is a link out to that PDF. Highly recommended if you're really thinking that you want to pursue advancing a health neighborhood with your organization in it. And again, this link goes to this PDF. There's not a lot of supportive material for this particular slide. It sort of is what it is. So the slide is probably just as good as the PDF, but if you're like me, you want the PDF, this link will take you there. And that is my talk for today. Thank you all very much.